Hello, my name's Kim Ellington. I'm a potter. I live here in the Vale community, about 4 miles here from Hart Square. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Groundhog Kiln. This kiln was constructed in 1987, and I was the principal designer of the kiln, and myself, as well as Bob Hart and whoever else was perhaps unfortunate enough to be standing around with nothing else to do, helped construct the kiln. And at the time that I met Bob Hart, I had a pottery shop in Hickory, North Carolina, and it would happen to be on the road that Bob Hart took as a shortcut to come out here to his farm. So he saw that I was a potter. He stopped in one evening and asked me if I would be interested in building a groundhog kiln for him. As you can tell, it's a rather large kiln. It's not the type of thing that you typically see in a pottery shop. So I was a bit skeptical as to his intentions and if he really was serious about such a project. And so he requested that I meet him for lunch one day, and he would bring me out here to Hart Square and show me what his intentions were. So I rode with him out here at lunchtime, and sure enough, as soon as I saw what he was doing with this place and with the construction going on, I immediately knew that he was serious. And so I said, yes, I would like to be able to take this on for you. However, you know, I've never constructed a kiln this size before, but perhaps we should get Berlin Craig involved with this. And Berlin Craig's a very well-known potter in the area. He passed away in 2002. But he was the last, what was really considered a traditional folk potter in the area. And he was also the only potter at the time still using a groundhog kiln. So I had become friends with Berlin through helping him fire his kiln. So I went and approached Berlin and asked him about the possibility of helping or giving guidance on building a groundhog kiln over here at this gentleman I'd met, this Dr. Bob Hart, and that he was wanting to build this kiln. And Berlin met me with the same amount of skepticism as that I met with Bob Hart. And I told him, I said, okay, well, do you have a little bit of time? Let's take a ride. Berlin lived just a few miles away. So I brought him over here so he could see the situation. And he, of course, then he realized, well, maybe these guys are actually serious. So at the time, Berlin was really, had some concern. He was the last person that still retained all the Catawba Valley knowledge of the clay and the glaze and the firing and the kiln. And he did have concern that he was the last man standing, so to speak, and it would be going out, it would be going away with him. So I think it helped kind of spark some enthusiasm in him to see that I was, I believe, 32 years old at the time, and he was glad to see a younger person getting involved with it. So the reason for information, it's called a groundhog kiln, and it is pretty well specific to the southeastern United States. However, there's different variations of the groundhog design. But the main reason it's called a groundhog kiln is this. What you're looking at here is the entrance to the kiln, where the pots are put in to be loaded and unloaded. And this, as you can also tell, it's a very low to the ground kiln, which kind of mimics a groundhog tunnel. But the main, I suppose, point of the groundhog component of it is when the potter goes crawling in and out of this hole here to put pots in and out of the kiln, it very well looks like a groundhog crawling in and out of his hole. So somehow or another that name stuck, and hence it's called a Groundhog Kiln. What I'd like to do is walk around to the front of the kiln and give you some more specifics on the design and some of the things that were involved in the construction as well as the firing process. This is the front of the Groundhog Kiln, what I refer to as the business end, where the fire actually happens. And this will give you a very good example of your typical Catawba Valley Groundhog Kiln. And I emphasize Catawba Valley, as I mentioned before, there are some variations on the Groundhog Kiln. And what you're seeing here is you're noticing that the crown of the kiln, or the arch of the kiln, and then you have 3 stoke holes here where wood is introduced, and then below the stoke holes you have draft holes where the air goes in. The height inside of the kiln here, the actual setting floor, is actually only 29 inches tall. So you have a very restricted space in the middle. The reason for that particular height becoming about during the early 19th century and all through well into the 20th century, there was not kiln furniture was not available to be able to stack wares. And the wares here in the Catawba Valley were glazed. They had a glaze on them, which when the glaze got hot, it melts and runs down. So therefore, you couldn't stack pots on top of each other either, or they would glue together. So what you have is a arch form here, and what you would do is you would load your pots in to conform to the size of the arch. In other words, your large 5-gallon pots, 4-gallon, 3-gallon, 2-gallon, 1-gallon, and then 1 quart. And so it makes a very efficient way to load the kiln. The particular thing that makes Catawba Valley unique in its kiln, perhaps more than anything, is the firebox. And the firebox is the most important feature of a kiln because that is what makes it work. It's like the carburetor on an engine. The firebox on the Catawba Valley kiln is actually built into the ground. This firebox here, you see, is actually 4 foot deep and 4 foot wide. And the way this kiln works is fired with pine slabs, such as this. And the slabs are introduced into the firebox like so, usually 3 or 4 at a time in each hole. And what happens here is the air actually comes in, down below, and up under the slab, and combustion, and then the flame goes back through the kiln. I virtually know of no other kiln design on the planet that incorporates a in-ground firebox such as this. So, as far as the design of the kiln goes, again, the construction, this is where Berlin was of most help, because he was the only one at the time that had actually used one of these kilns and had used one consecutively. Of course, my main interest in talking with him was I was going to say, hey, Berlin, how do I do this, or how do I do that? Well, I started asking him some of these technical questions, and he laughed. He said, well, I don't know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? You're the master potter guy, right? He said, I didn't build that kiln. And then it hit me. I realized, no, he didn't build that kiln. He purchased his pottery and kiln. And so he had never built a kiln before. He had kind of helped when he was a kid. He had helped a couple of times. So it was like, okay, well, at least we have a working model to go from. So we had the Berlin Craig kiln, which was still in use and working. So I went over to start investigating it and talking with Berlin. And he mentioned that he still had the forms, the arch board forms that creates this curve. This is a very particular curve here, actually. And of course, to have an arch, you have to have your proportions right and such for it to be supportive. And so anyway, he mentioned that he still had the arch forms from when his kiln was built, if that would help any. And of course, it was a tremendous help. And so then when we went to get these arch boards, which are over in the pottery shop now, came to find out as we looked at them, I went over there with Bob Hart to pick them up, and we brought them back. There was 4 forms, and there wasn't a nail in any of them. They were all pegged, and they're obviously lending themselves to the 19th century construction. And in talking with Berlin, he just said, well, they've just always been here. They've been, handed from neighbor to neighbor. So evidently, the form we used for this was the exact same form that had been used for at least a century. And of course that made Bob Hart very happy to know that he was using authentic dimensions. So what you have here is the inside dimension is 10 foot wide, 29 inches tall, and the setting floor is 16 foot long. The chamber of this kiln is slightly shorter than Berlin's. That was one of the pieces of advice I picked up from him. His kiln was longer than this kiln. However, the problem with that was the temperature. It's very difficult to get the correct temperature that far back into the kiln. And it was very frustrating. You had to mix a special glaze for that area of the kiln, and sometimes it still didn't get hot enough. So his recommendation was to shorten the kiln by about 5 feet and make it much more efficient, and which it did. So what happens here is while this kiln's burning, is you're introducing the slabs through here. The flames coming up under, the air's coming up underneath the slabs, combusting them, and then the flame rolls back through the kiln and exits through the chimney. Pine is the wood, the fuel that you use for such a thing. The reason being is pine combusts and releases its heat quickly, and it has a long flame. And this is what is known as a cross draft kiln. In other words, you have your fire at one end and your chimney at the other. So the construction of the kiln technically involved, I believe it was right at about 8,500 brick for the kiln. Now, we didn't make our own brick. Of course, the old guys, old school, they made their own brick. We didn't go there. For one thing, we didn't know anybody that knew how to make the brick because it requires a specific clay. This fire brick here, this is not your normal fire brick. This isn't the kind of fire brick that's in your fireplace at home. This fire brick here fires to a maximum of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Interestingly enough, the brick that they did used to make, though, which Berlin's kiln was made out of, was just as capable. They used the local clay that's here in the Catawba Valley. Is a very high temperature clay. Not only does it make good pottery, but it also makes good brick. So the construction of it involved placing the arch forms on top of the foundation we had built, and then running 1x6 slats along the top of the arch boards. It looks somewhat like a lobster cage, I suppose, would be a way to describe it. And then what you do is you lay your brick. We have a series of straight brick and wedge brick, which are the tapered brick. And you simply lay the brick on top of that form as they conform to the form. And then after your arch is constructed, you have your form is up on shims, and you knock the shims out, the form drops, and pull it out. I believe the construction of this one, we started in early spring, and of course had you know, I had a full-time business going myself at the time, as well as Bob Hart and his many projects. So we had our first firing in it in November of '87. And it was somewhat successful. First firings are always very difficult, but it does fire exceptionally well. And yes, this kiln will fire in 10 hours. However, I typically fire in a longer cycle to 12 to 13 to even 14 hours. The benefit to that is you get more flame interaction and atmosphere interaction with your pots. Really been one of the major benefits of having this kiln here at Hart Square is the fact that it is used. It is a functional kiln, and people do come and participate in the firing. And in that way, not only has the tradition actually been able to survive, so to speak, it is actually flourishing. I've been able to move on and build my own kiln at my house and expand my business. Other potters that have been introduced to this kiln have done the same, and it has actually helped the whole pottery community at large grow. And it's been very important to not just maintain a tradition, but to actually flourish. And it's been very helpful in that. I don't know the exact number of times this kiln's been fired. I quit counting at firing number 35, and that was almost 10 years ago. So it's a very important resource for the community, and Bob Hart fortunately had the vision to realize that it would be an important thing to do, and I was lucky enough to be the guy standing there with my hands in my pocket said, "Come here."